It's a pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, who is Symon Quy from the University of Bedfordshire, where he's a senior lecturer in English and also works at the National Film and Television School. And he is going to talk about Lord Byron, the man behind the myth of the vampire. So, Symon, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
You're welcome. And thank you very much for that introduction, Duncan. I will screen share the PowerPoint now. So, as you heard, I'm Symon Quy, and today's presentation is looking at Lord Byron, the man behind the myth of Dracula. And I wanted to give you an indication of the structure. So this presentation explores certain recognisable tropes of the vampire story in literature and film, but with a particular focus on the depiction of the vampire as seductively aristocratic. It first locates literary antecedents of this characterisation within fiction from the Romantic era of the early 1800s, looking particularly at John William Polidori's novella called The Vampire, which was published in 1819. Then it goes on to talk about the poet George Gordon Lord Byron as a source of the myth of the patrician or nobleman vampire. Finally, I consider how representations of aspects of Byron's life have impacted upon popular culture and suggest how these might be decoded within key sequences of a recent film by a British director, Emerald Fennell, called Saltburn, that some of you may have seen. So, as Christopher Frayling, the author of Vampires, a literary anthology, tells us, the vampire is as old as the world. He suggests that this might be because blood tastes of the sea, where we all come from. I don't set out here, however, to consider in any depth those vampiric bloodlines found in folklore, as you can see on the screen in front of you. Suffice to note at this point humankind's abiding interest in the beast of the blood within us. So those of you who were able to attend Derby will no doubt know very much about the literary, theatrical and cinematic popularisation of the vampire and how he became urbane, suave, sophisticated and a patrician, a nobleman. And the myth of Dracula owes a huge debt to Hamilton Dean's theatrical adaptation of the novel, described as when the curtain rose, Dracula debuted in evening wear and a cloak. The monstrous Nosferatu of the novel was recast as an urbane and sophisticated figure. And it's this dimension of Dracula to which we turn our attention now. We can read in Bram Stoker's novel a physical description of his vampire with only the blood-red lips adding colour to the palest of portraits. So much for the Count's physicality, but what of his personality? The combination of chilling menace and aristocratic charm are traits that have become instantly recognisable, if not stereotypical, in contemporary popular culture. Central to these character traits in Stoker's novel, a veneer covering the vampire's true bestiality, is that of the suave, seductive nobleman. But to understand the source of this character trait and the discreet charm of Count Dracula, we need to go further back in literature, indeed some 80 or so years prior to Stoker's publication. So John William Polidori wrote a novella called The Vampire in 1819, which was developed from an incomplete story by the poet George Gordon Lord Byron. And this novella is frequently viewed as the progenitor of the romantic vampire genre of fantasy fiction. The work's described by Frayling as the first story to successfully fuse the disparate elements of vampirism into a coherent literary genre. Polidori claimed that it was written over 2 or 3 idle mornings in July 1816, but it was eventually to see publication anonymously in the Regency London of 1819. On its release, the story, about a vampire named Lord Ruthven was popularly regarded as being both by and about Lord Byron, whose celebrity as a poet and sexual libertine was at its peak at this time. And interestingly, Lord Ruthven, the vampire's aristocratic camera, shares the same name as the central male figure in Lady Caroline Lamb's novel Glenarvan, published a few years before. Caroline Lamb had famously described her lover as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And her depiction of him, combined with the craven sexuality and dark desires of the vampire in Polidori's novella, firmly cemented the living legend of Lord Byron as vampiric in the eyes of the reading public. So George Gordon led an extraordinary life, and there isn't space to tell you too much about that today. I've had to reduce it to some bullet points. But it's the writings of this man and members of his literary circle in the Romantic era which might be considered as the gestation period of the vampire as aristocratic. Byron had probably encountered tales of the vampire on his grand tour of Europe from 1809 to 1811, and in John Stagg's poem, also called The Vampire, of 1810. So Byron, interestingly, was born into an impoverished branch of a noble family in London on the 22nd of January 1788. But he was brought up in Aberdeen by his mother, a Scottish woman who was known as Catherine of the Clan Gordon, because his largely absent father, Mad Jack Byron, had died in 1791. And it's amazing if you study the Byron family, because they've all got such exciting names like Mad Jack and Wicked Lord Byron, who was Byron's great uncle. And indeed, when he died on the 21st of May 1798, this 10-year-old Scottish lad, though born in London, became the 6th Baron Byron of Rochdale and inherited this amazing ancestral home, Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire, not far from Derby, where we first met many of you. So Byron, as every young gentleman, was expected to attended Harrow School and then Cambridge University. But then he undertook a dissipated grand tour of Europe, writing as he travelled. Dissipated is a polite way of saying drunken and debauched. And he was very much a young, affluent, good-looking fella who was sexually profligate during this time. But on returning to London and the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, his extended poem, he says that he awoke one morning and found myself famous. And that poem told the story of a young nobleman's grand tour, like a sort of gap year or two after graduating, as we might have nowadays, where young people go travelling. So it was Lord Byron's poem called The Giaour, a fragment of a Turkish tale that was written in 1810 but published finally in 1813, which first declares Byron's interest in the vampiric, and it was developed from folk tales that he encountered on his travels. And this poem is one of the first depictions of that recognisable exotic Eastern vampire that we know so well, who is doomed to feed eternally on his own family, his own progeny. And these are the key lines that set up that image of a vampire that was built into Dracula and that we now know so well. But first on earth as vampire sent, thy corse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghastly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. There from thy daughter, sister, wife, at midnight drain the stream of life, yet loathe the banquet which perforce must feed thy livid living course. Thy victims, ere they yet expire, shall know the demon for their sire. As cursing thee, thou cursing them, thy flowers are withered on the stem. wet with thine own best blood shall drip, thy gnashing tooth and haggard lip. Then stalking to thy sullen grave, go, and with ghouls and afrits rave, till these in horror shrink away from spectre more accursed than they. So the word corpse here means corpse, and we can see that here the vampire is a disinterred corpse risen from a sullen grave who feeds on females from his own family and is considered to be the highest order of demon. Is this section then, partly at least, something of a confessional by Lord Byron? So some more facts about his life. Now considered to be the first ever celebrity, Byron's public image was largely a reflection of the character he created. Child, meaning young nobleman, Harold. From 1812, Byron became the darling of the London cultural scene and engaged in a series of affairs, seeming to live as promiscuous a life as his literary creation. It's even alleged that Byron had an affair with his half-sister, Augustus Lee, the only surviving child of their father's first marriage. Rumours of incest surrounded the pair. Augusta's daughter, Medora, was suspected to have been Byron's child. And you can imagine, in a time which was becoming increasingly socially conscious, the scandal of this erupted across London. And to escape from growing debts and rumours, Byron married Annabella Milbank, who was said to be the heiress of a rich uncle. They married in January 1815, and their daughter, Ada Lovelace, was born the same year. But the scandal of separating from this wife less than a year after they were married meant, alongside those rumours about Augusta, meant that he was forced to leave England in April 16, never to return. So he travelled then through Europe, and on his second journey rented a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva. During the year without a summer, in June 1816, a volcanic ash cloud had interrupted the weather, and the weather was despicable. It was pouring down, and these writers were trapped indoors. So, alongside a circle of friends comprising Percy Shelley and his wife Mary, who actually wrote Frankenstein at this time, and Claire Clairmont, Mary's stepsister and one of Byron's numerous lovers, who also happened to be carrying his child, they had a writing competition. Also part of this literary company was Byron's personal physician, Dr. John William Polidori, who was to take Byron's fragmentary piece and develop it into a fuller piece of work in his novel, The Vampire. So, The Burial, a fragment of a novel, this is a different text from the previous one I talked about, which also has the word fragment in the title, so not to be confused, is where we see the first depiction of the vampire in literature as sophisticated and patrician. A nobleman in the character of Augustus Darvale, a man of considerable fortune and ancient family, as reported by his younger travelling companion and the narrator of the piece. As Darvale dies on the narrator's shoulder, the young companion is shocked to see the corpse's face instantly turn black and his body begin to rapidly decompose. As Byron wrote, "I was shocked with the sudden certainty which could not be mistaken. His countenance in a few minutes became nearly black. I should have attributed so rapid a change to poison had I not been aware that he had had no opportunity of receiving it unperceived. The day was declining, the body was rapidly altering, and nothing remained but to fulfil his request." Sadly, Byron chose to take this story no further at the time, but that sequence has been utilised many, many times in film and literature of this rapid decomposition. We can see it in Hammer horrors and recent versions of Dracula, such as Luc Besson's last year. So, moving on then to this young woman, Lord Byron's only legitimate child who sadly was not brought up by her father, but by her mother, and her father was absent in her life, but she went on to become immensely successful in her own right. She was an English mathematician whose prototype of a computer code has led to her being considered to be the grandmother of computing. Quite interesting if we think of that art-science divide. Was she effectively showing her rejection of her father here? And Emerald Fennell, an interesting young actor who you can see on the screen there, who played in Victoria, became very interested in Byron through her research for the character she was playing. Having established the literary origins of the vampire in terms of his depiction as an aristocrat, then, we can look at Emerald Fennell's film Saltburn of 2023 that some of you may have known. Being cast as Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace, in the ITV series Victoria, led her to research for the role that led to a fuller understanding of the life of the poet. Ada Lovelace never had a relationship with her father, who only knew her as a baby during a short period of separation from his wife Annabella. On being shown his healthy infant daughter, Byron was reported to have said, "Oh, what an instrument of torture I've acquired in you." Not the standard way of greeting a new life, I would imagine. Becoming familiar with such details from the life of Lord Byron, Fennell was able to cleverly repurpose aspects of Byron's myth, though, and encode these within her film, as we see nowadays in lots of depictions of Dracula or Dracula vampire stories. To some extent, Saltburn might be considered as a knowing homage to dimensions of the story with a key, the roman à clef. Informed viewers may decipher aspects of the life and times of Lord Byron within Saltburn's telling of its tale. At Saltburn's gala premiere at the London Film Festival in 2023, Fennell said, "Certainly, Saltburn is metaphorically a vampire film. It's about what we do when we're completely besotted with something or someone. And I hope it's part of the classic Gothic tradition where love and hate are very, very close together." These tropes are portrayed throughout sequences of Saltburn. The film announces its Gothic intentions with the elaborate font of the opening title sequence and its depiction of the aristocratic Casson family and their stately home Saltburn, from which the film takes its title. Saltburn and its lake have been likened to Newstead Abbey, the ancestral home of the Byron family near Nottingham. Fennell has spoken about how the creative choice of setting her film in a Gothic British country house builds upon the well-known literary text that preceded it. The Gothic British country house tends to be quite meta already, she says. So Brideshead Revisited comes from Jude the Obscure, then Atonement is looking at those, and then you have Rebecca. All of these places, even Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, was already satirising this genre. Knowing wink at Newstead Abbey? So the only thing that's useful about that is familiarity it gives the audience, because you can only really make something uncanny, disturbing, if somebody's familiar with something. You're using those things carefully so that people think they know what they're getting. So Newstead Abbey, in many ways, is similar to the ancestral home of Saltburn. And you can see that in these two images. Well worth a visit if you ever get a chance, not far from Derby itself. The cast of Saltburn fulfil many of the functions of characters traditionally depicted in Gothic literature. The director plays games with the dramatic arts of these characters, however, and at times subverts our expectations of Gothic conventions and archetypes. In the early part of the film, it's Felix, played by Jacob Elordi, who appears to be portrayed as a Byronic hero. Felix is devastatingly handsome, sexually hungry and supremely confident, where Oliver is wrongly attired, socially awkward and of low social status. As the story progresses, however, we see Oliver gradually assume Felix's character traits in his upwardly mobile journey through the confidence and subsequent death of each of the Catton family members. As he establishes himself at Saltburn, Oliver takes on another familiar Gothic mantle, that of the anti-hero. It is Oliver, then, who by the end of the film, dancing naked through his dubiously acquired mansion, who might be considered the truest ancestor of Lord Byron for the 20th century, and an encoded continuation of Lord Dracula from the novel. So Byron's legacy lives on in varied popular culture. As you know, books, comic, magazines, even games. And I hope we've seen something of that journey through literature and film into contemporary society. So just to say, there's some references here that people may be interested in if they wish to follow this up. And I'm also available to send people a copy of this paper or the one that was presented in fuller detail at Derby about the film Saltburn. If people want to send me an email, I'm happy to forward that to them.
Thank you, Simon. That was great. And I have to admit, I don't know very much about Lord Byron or Saltburn, come to that. So I've learned something today. Thank you. We've got time for any questions. If you have a question, you can either just type it into chat or unmute and ask your question directly. Can I start with a question?
Yeah, far away, Duncan.
I'm interested in this relationship between Polidori and Byron, because you said that Lord Ruthven in Polidori's is an aristocrat. So did Byron invent this patrician kind of vampire after Polidori, or did he kind of reinvent it more or less from scratch himself?
Well,
so who started it off?
Polidori took a scrap of an original story, this fragment, and in that we get this depiction of the nobleman, and he developed that into the novella that was hugely popular. I mean, everybody read it in London. You know, it was literally the Taylor Swift of its day. Right. Everybody had an opinion on Lord Byron and his activities. And this novel, when it first came out, everybody wanted to know about the life of Lord Byron. And this novella was first published with no name on it, which added to the mystery. Then the publisher added LB, which people thought, well, that proves it's Lord Byron. And then eventually Byron disproved that and said, I didn't write this. And John William Polidori was finally credited with it. So the truth is, the first full-length piece of writing about the patrician vampire is John William Polidori, but the first depiction of that character is in the poetry of Lord Byron himself.
Right, got it. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? We've had a few comments. Alexandra said it's worth mentioning that Saltburn even has some stuff about bodily fluids too, although not blood. I haven't seen Saltburn, but maybe you can comment on that.
Well, it actually does have some very direct references to blood. In my other paper, I talk about some scenes. There's a bathtub scene where Oliver Quick ingests semen from a masturbation sequence. I mean, it is pretty violent stuff. And there's also a scene with the Catton family's daughter, who Oliver Quick says, I'm a vampire, luckily for you, before performing cunnilingus on her during her menstruation, during her cycle. So it's pretty shocking cinema. And that's all, of course, what the director is playing games with, because she knows this is going to get people talking. Interestingly, in America, to promote the film, they made little plastic bathtubs because that scene is so graphic and shocking.
Yeah, there's just been a response here from Alexander. Said, I was thinking of the bath scene, but somehow I'd forgotten the second scene mentioned.
Yeah, sorry for those of you who haven't had their lunch yet. Apologies for that, but it's there in the film. It's quite shocking.
Okay, we've had some other comments. So there are other people also interested in Byron. So Joel's plugging his research into the Byronic tradition in the Gothic. You can see the website there. And Katie has said she very much enjoyed the talk. She's been to Newstead Abbey loads of times and loves hearing about the life of Lord Byron. I take it then Newstead Abbey's open to the public.
It is. It's similar to a National Trust property, but it's run by Nottingham City Council, who have also currently got an exhibition in their central library about the life of Lord Byron. And it's really worth a visit. It's not open every weekend, and they're doing a lot of repair work, but they've got some amazing stuff to do with his life. And it's a scandalous life in many ways. If you're interested, the rest is history. Do a 4-part series on his life and times. The first of which I think is called The Birth of a Vampire. So it's worth pursuing that. 4 hours of detailed information. I didn't have an opportunity to do that in the presentation, I'm afraid. I was just pinning it down on that idea of the vampire as a nobleman with a depraved sexual appetite.
Okay, thanks. And there's a comment from Dottie. It said possibly worth contacting Newstead Abbey admin with a view to expanding on this. I guess this is the Byron connection. This is a new take for me. I know the Abbey very well, living only about 7 miles from it. We've got a question from Darcy. Do you have any comments on the fiction about Byron as a vampire? For example, Tom Holland's books.
I've just read that. Sorry, just read the first chapter of that. So I'm very much looking forward to reading it during half term. I think Tom Holland is a clever man and actually had a bit of an obsession, I think, with the life and times of Byron. And I'm sure it will be very well informed. I haven't read it all myself, so I can't recommend it. But I firmly recommend Holland because I think he's a very clever, informed man.
Great. Okay, it's just come up to 1 o'clock. So let's draw things to a close. On behalf of everybody here, can I say a big thank you to Simon for a fascinating talk all about Lord Byron? Yeah, and feel free to use the React bar at the bottom to show your appreciation or just turn on your camera and applaud.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for their questions and to Joel, because I'll definitely follow up your link that you put in there. I'm sure that's going to be an interesting one to look at.